Hey, what's up? It's time for some Space Engineer stuff. Apologies if I sound a bit weird. I don't know what it is, but my voice is all kinds of gravelly today and I can't get rid of it no matter how much water I drink, so apologies. I'll try to drink a lot of water throughout. Today is how a Dreadnaught battleship, or just a battleship, fared in about 1 year of Space Engineers PvP, without ever being truly lost, that is completely destroyed. A couple things to clarify. This is based off of a Space Engineers RP PvP server. So while there is roleplay elements, it is not hard scripted, it's very free-flowing, and the outcomes that you'll hear about in this video weren't at all set in stone. This was very much emergent gameplay. If you're interested in this, I'll mention it a couple times, it is a series on my channel called Outlands. It follows the events of this ship, as the ship is the focal point of this series. If you are new here, this server isn't a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week server like a typical Space Engineers PvP or survival server would be. Instead, it's far closer to a thing we do every Friday that more mimics, say, D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, or a turn-based style game. But instead of, rolling a die or having a GM tell you what happens, the moves or the events are played out in Space Engineers as the medium. Say a faction attacks a base, we play that base attack out freeform in Space Engineers. However, getting to that base will typically be handled outside of Space Engineers. If this sounds interesting to you, I have a video pinned on my channel, or you can just watch the series to get an idea of what exactly this entails. Got that out of the way, let's get started. The Eternity's Advent battleship is the ship of focus today. It's the Dreadnaught, and it's mentioned in the title. I use the term Dreadnaught semi-loosely here. Yes, I'm aware of the real-life meaning of it. I have a degree in that. But sci-fi typically uses the word Dreadnaught differently than IRL, right? Usually Dreadnaught means larger than battleship class in sci-fi. So in this case, lore-wise, she's actually just a battleship from the Earth Federal Navy top-of-the-line ship. However, in an emergency, she had to flee Earth space and go to a backwater system on a one-way trip. That she can only get there, she can't come back. However, the units deployed there are much lower quality or lower scale size, hence I call it a Dreadnaught here because the other battleships in the series are typically actually quite much smaller. So she's about 24,000 blocks, while a typical battleship doesn't even break 10,000 blocks. Okay, we distinguish this gap as 6th generational versus 5th generational. One final thing to understand. The circumstance of this event was obviously planned out as the premise of this entire playthrough. So the Eternity was designed and built, obviously, to mimic a specific Halo ship, but also to be immensely survivable, have multiple bulkheads, be incredibly tough, have resources and the ability to manufacture and keep herself going by herself. But she was also never really meant to be this super ship that takes on everyone by itself. She was meant to function in a fleet. So she has intentional weaknesses, and you'll see them develop, some that we designed and some that we didn't realize would manifest throughout this retelling, so to speak. So, of course, the scenario starts, the Eternity ends up in this new system, no way to get home, and with no allies, no relationships, nothing whatsoever, and that creates the interesting dynamic this entire series is based on. Alright, finally we got that out of the way. Apologies, but for some people, or a lot of people that watch these videos, typically they don't know the backstory, and that's kind of important to understand. I'll go through my thought process because I don't know if you know, I am the captain of the Eternity's Advent, and I go through a lot of my thought processes because we have about a week between moves and we have to plan things out, so on and so forth. So as the Eternity landed in system, we found ourselves in between a minor or major war between two of the main factions, the CDF, Civilian Defense Force, and the Riders. Upon arriving in the system, we ended up in an interesting situation where we were mistakenly attacked by a Rider squadron who thought we were a CDF vessel, and the battle was quite interesting. We were very inexperienced rolling into this with only 1 or 2 mock test battles before this to kind of get a vibe for how the ship handled. Going into it, my current battle strategy was very much to leverage our very high effective HP pool, for the lack of a better term, to move fairly slowly in Space Engineers term, only about 30 meters per second relative, and to rely on the main batteries of 10 barrels each of the 400mm weapon, the largest turret in our server, and to engage enemies with that. It has, at this point, fairly terrible accuracy past 100 meters, even though they can range out to about 19,000 meters. However, due to the combination of, at this time, destroyers being the dominant enemy force, with most capitals really only being brawling-style vessels, we found this tactic worked very well. So in the multiple times we were engaged, the plan of action was simple. We stay fairly still and stationary, that 30 meters a second, and we range out our manual fire weapons to about 1,200 meters, and farther if we get a chance. The end result is that we were not very hyper-offensive and we weren't that lethal, but enemies would eventually need to commit to the fight or suffer slow attrition. Early on, most factions did not know how to deal with this. Thus, we would win most battles simply by being a behemoth of a force, and this early tactic worked quite well, and our first battles proved quite successful. As the CDF and Rider War progressed, the Eternity was in a weird position. We were not allies with either side because we didn't really trust them. However, there was one big fear that was beginning to materialize. The reality was quickly forming that the CDF was not happy with us just waltzing through their territory. So we began to devise emergency contingencies to fight the CDF. Myself and Ace, my XO, discussed the reality of this war, and we had several plans laid out. We were already observing the effects of the Rider versus the CDF war, and the Riders were very capital ship-centric, and they used a very similar strategy to us. Not necessarily slow-moving, but a united single squadron moves slowly together and unleashes heavy firepower. However, the issue is the CDF quickly found out that even with an inferior force, they could surround this relatively slow-moving clump of ships and close in at the same time. And while one of the ships might take the brunt of it, typically the one that got there slightly ahead of everyone else, the surrounding nature of this attack would quickly overwhelm the capital ships in the center, and they would get attrited. Sometimes they would win, sometimes they would just get really messed up, but at the end of the day, the CDF was able to leverage destroyers to take out cruisers and higher, because the strategy functionally didn't work. We view this as very similar to what we were doing initially, where we didn't move very much, and we used heavier weapons to kind of leverage that into a win. We decided this wasn't going to work even before the first CDF battle was fought. Our goal was to do what is functionally called a spoiling attack. We noticed that the CDF liked to surround their target and then close in simultaneously. We theorized that if we allowed the CDF to begin surrounding us and kind of played into this, they would want to use the strategy. However, before the trap was sprung, because they were fairly new at PvP as well, we could do that spoiling attack and go immediately out of nowhere all in on a singular target. And then we would go from one target to the next until the battle was won, functionally putting the CDF on the back foot. In practice, this worked exceedingly well. The CDF, who had never fought the Eternity to this point, were not ready for us to switch up our strategy. While we were heavily outnumbered, we were able to put on heavy pressure, never allowing the CDF to spring that noose or fully surround us and attack simultaneously. Instead, because they were spread out and trying to collapse upon us, this ended up in a situation with a lot of their ships being spread out, and we could use this to our advantage and go from one ship to the next. This victory allowed us to heavily damage the squadron that was deployed against us in the opening stages of the war when the CDF declared war on us, and resulted in the famous destroyed Cutlass Destroyer, which ended up actually being a rally cry for the CDF for the rest of the war. Remember the Cutlass, because we blew it up pretty bad. However, after this battle, there were some concerning signs beginning to set in. We had received actually moderate damage against what amounted to be a destroyer-only squadron. While we won this battle, we were but a lone vessel deep in enemy territory, and our most successful battle was one destroyer destroyed, only. At the time, the CDF, this was unaware to us, had about 60 destroyers available to them. While they had no capital ships at this time, and 20 of these destroyers or so were tied up in the Rider War, that still left a large amount of destroyers available to ruin our day. In retrospect, it was about 2 to 3 destroyer squadrons that were dedicated at containing us, and the results quickly materialized. Even in this first battle, and for sure with the second battle that followed up almost immediately, the Eternity was not being defeated, but we were beginning to feel the effects of prolonged combat without a support fleet. While the Eternity did have the ability to support herself via her own assemblers, large crew, right, we had about 8 people, we were beginning to burn through our ice reserves, which was harder to get, ammo was down to 30%, main battery was down to 10%, about 2,000 shells, and our metal grids, which ended up being a recurring theme, were almost utterly depleted. For those that don't play Space Engineers, metal grid is what is needed to make heavy armor, and this ship really relies on her heavy armor, more so than her shields. For balance reasons, the Eternity actually has almost no shields. They're mainly there for convenience factor. So we made the decision that we needed to focus around resources to potentially win this war. So we headed over to a moon and went into orbit and detached a ground team to get resources. However, while we were in orbit of the moon, before sending that team down, we decided we needed to buy more time. If we just hung out in the orbit of the moon with half of our team on the ground, well, we would be in a very vulnerable position. So we decided to preemptively strike, since the war was already going, and attacked a nearby staging area, another 4 destroyers, and now a forward operating base. This time, however, things did not go nearly as well, and we may have bitten off more than we chewed. We tried the same strategy again, right? We do that spoiling attack when the CDF tried to surround us. However, the CDF was a cunning foe, and they've practiced this, and they saw our previous strategy, which in retrospect maybe we shouldn't have reused. But this time they were able to spring the noose really fast. We're talking under 2 minutes. And this was too little time for us to try to counter it with a spoiling attack. We weren't ready for it. So, while we were kind of able to get on ships, it happened roughly at the same time as we got encircled at about 2,000 meters, and fire would begin to pour in from all directions. And while the Eternity is an immensely powerful and survivable ship, we had multiple issues on hand. Number one, destroyers were actually really fast, especially if the ship was moving laterally relative to us and our gun battery was trying to engage it. That's a lot of relative movement. We also found out that the Eternity's ass, her thruster pack in the rear, was also a massive weak spot, which was an easy location for ships to swing behind at and hide in and rest, quote unquote, like get reestablished, or simply deal a lot of damage in an unprotected area with no armor. This is about when the capital killer DDK, a destroyer 1000, was deployed by the CDF. This is a destroyer that, instead of its medium weapons that destroyers are known for, instead had a large capital-grade axial weapon, the 1000mm Lance. While it is extremely less accurate than the 1500mm Lance that the Eternity possesses, it proved to be quite devastating against a very slow vessel like the Eternity deployed in mass. While the Eternity would eventually go on to destroy the FOB and another destroyer, bringing us up to 2 destroyer kills, the call was given that the Eternity was taking unsubstantial, unrecoverable levels of damage, and the Eternity retreated about the same time the CDF looked to bail out. Thus, we actually did end up having a small window in which we could resupply on the moon while trying to repair the Eternity itself. Ultimately, we were able to get a lot of raw resources on the moon, which was good. We got about 50% of it onto the ship, and we were attacked again. And while this battle was largely confined to the lunar surface, it was a really close call, and the Eternity once again would not be at her full store levels. She was roughly at 50% now. At this point, it was becoming abundantly clear. There weren't many strategies available to us as a large vessel against a lot of smaller vessels. Our goal now was to get allies, and the Riders would prove to be that ally. So we began to transit back to the Rider HQ for exactly this purpose. However, before getting there, we would link up with a Rider ship, a armored cruiser, the Midnight Oil. This was being chased by a CDF squadron, which, once again, 3 destroyers, but also a brand new cruiser that came off the line. This was the Autumn Heavy Cruiser. I've actually made a video on how successful this ship was. I'll have that video up here. But this was actually her first deployment, and it was not one of her better ones. While it would prove to be one of the more successful CDF ships, this would be a pretty bad day, because it turned out with another armored cruiser present, the Eternity was able to flip the script from the previous destroyer-centric battles. The destroyers were incredibly nimble, and while they couldn't really hurt the Eternity as much, they were able to easily suppress her. However, with a cruiser, it turned out the Eternity was actually well designed or well suited to destroying slightly slower, slightly larger ships, and she did exactly that. Upon entering the field, the Eternity was able to turn her main battery onto the heavy cruiser and destroy her in under 20 seconds. While she would go on to limp out of the battle, it was a rough wake-up call for the CDF, as their first cruiser essentially, on this front, was wiped out in under 30 seconds. The Oil, which was now acting in concert with the Eternity, would end up being very useful at keeping the destroyers occupied while the Eternity dealt with the capital threats. And then once the destroyers were all that remained, the escort, it turned out while you could dodge fire from one direction quite easily, as soon as you had crossing fields of fire, 2 ships, the destroyers were torn apart rapidly. Thus, with this event and the Rider CDF war going quite poorly for the Riders at this point, the EFN, Eternity, and the Riders entered into a mutual alliance, as our goals now aligned as we needed the CDF out of our hair. From here, several back-to-back battles occurred that led to the finale of the war. We continued using a similar strategy, which now was kind of revitalized as a useful strategy. The CDF was still trying that noose closing technique, and the Eternity would simply strike before the noose could close, and it kind of became a battle of who could set up first. However, the new adaptations here came into both maneuverability strategies and changes, right? How to turn the script on the CDF. If we allowed a ship to come in behind us, we actually came up with maneuvers such that we can come about rapidly, engage that ship, and then kind of flip the strip on it and kind of get a cheeky kill in. We also figured out how to maneuver with other allies, which ended up being incredibly important, as the Eternity is very much a force multiplier. And that really was about it. It was very small changes to a basic strategy that both sides were trying to refine. However, ultimately, the Eternity, with a support fleet that was actually supporting her, ended up being too much of a force multiplier, and the CDF were not able to figure out a way to defeat the Eternity. Thus, the war began to conclude. However, before the final all-in, the CDF brought something quite unique. It was a forward operating base with a massive amounts of thrusters strapped to it, and then 4 1500mm Lance batteries. These are the heaviest weapon in this universe. They're quite hard to hit, but they do devastating amounts of damage. This, combined with even a basic destroyer escort, was actually enough to rapidly incapacitate the Eternity. These weapons would hit slightly after each other, creating a staggered explosive effect, and would largely mitigate the whole Eternity's staggered hull design, punching through multiple bulkheads into the squishy interior. At this point, the Eternity shields were nothing but a formality, and none of them ever lasted for more than 20 seconds into a fight. The Eternity would join up later with the battleship Ravager from the Rider to finish the job against this FOB with destroyer escort. However, this time the FOB had multiple cruisers in tow, and a hell of a fight broke out. I'd love to give insight on what our strategy was, and we tried to come up with multiple ideas here, but the end result was the Leviathan kind of had us outmatched, for reasons I'll get into. But the only strategy that really made any sense was to take the Eternity and drive right up to the FOB and try to kill it faster than it could kill us. So while the Leviathan had similar firepower to what the Eternity did, what she didn't have was a massive superstructure. So the Eternity could take several times more damage than the Leviathan could, while the Ravager kind of supported us against the cruisers or the Leviathan. And that's basically how it played out. We drove right up next to it, and we basically gambled that we could take more than the Leviathan could, and that the Leviathan would bleed out faster than the Eternity. Which it did. Barely, though. Thus, with the war concluded, Leviathan destroyed, and the CDF brought to the peace tables, the Eternity was towed, barely alive, to a Rider shipyard to be repaired. However, in this repair, we decided to introduce some upgrades to make her more adept at fighting this war. While we couldn't up the shields because we didn't have the requisite materials, the system just doesn't have those, we were able to do some slight alterations to kind of get her up to snuff. Especially the last 3 to 4 battles really begin to illustrate massive fundamental issues with the Eternity as a solo or duo ship. The big issue was Eternity, relatively speaking, was not dealing out that much damage. She was very slow and a very big target. So while gunnery crews could expect maybe 10% accuracy or lower at optimal engagement ranges, about 1500 meters, hostiles were expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% hit rates, even at 1500 to 2000 meters, which was extremely high, simply because the Eternity is such a big target. And we would regularly even get hit at 5,000 or 10,000 meters at roughly 5% hit rate. This was a problem that needed to be solved. The other big issue that was illustrated in this war is that the Eternity, actually with very little effort, maybe 8 destroyers, 10 destroyers total, could be easily attrited down over 2 to 3 battles and either deplete her ammunition reserves or destroy her ability to recover, or just simply attack her so fast she has no time to recover, or a combination of all of these, would result in a situation where the Eternity functionally would be attrited and combat ineffective after 2 to 3 battles. So while she would win those battles, it would not be such devastating wins that the CDF with their massive destroyer reserve couldn't keep us pinned down, or hypothetically any enemy. The Eternity also had no allies at this point. The Riders had a large change in ethos and leadership and left the EFN alliance while forming a new alliance with the CDF, the COA. With that, there was a huge rustle on the EFN side of things. Myself and the officers had to figure out how to solve these problems rapidly. On the combat side of things, we did a couple things. For starters, we really went all in on the Eternity's main battery. It was the main casualty inflicting weapon, and it also gave us breathing room, because ships would be, especially novice ships pilots, would be unwilling to close quarter ranges with us. So we added 5 more barrels to that. Her main lance battery, that axial weapon, while less useful, is extremely niche, but relevant when preventing other capital ships from just vibe checking us at point blank range. If someone comes super close, we just hit them with the lance, which is about the effective range of it, and we upgraded that from 2 barrels to 4. Most importantly, however, Eternity's targeting and tracking computer was upgraded, and we had an automated script for us, such that when targets close within a certain range, we could switch to computer tracking, and our guns would be very accurate in CQB, which is actually, weirdly enough, where pilots or gunners have trouble aiming because they're so close and the traversal rate just doesn't work out. We also, this is a real life thing, the weapon pack we were using had the velocity of the main battery weapon buffed by a significant amount, alongside secondary weapons also being buffed across the board, not just for the Eternity, but for everyone. This had an interesting scaling effect in that the Eternity was already being hit so much that an increase in accuracy by the weapons going faster actually didn't end up doing as much to the Eternity as the Eternity would do to other ships, because now it was actually feasible that we could take out destroyers in rapid fashion. On the flip side, we also switched our strategy. While most of Season 1, our goal was always centered around how do we win battles. At this point, it was discussed upon with the officers what we should do, and the ultimate conclusion was we can't win battles anymore. We cannot win 1v4s. So while we could maybe squeak out a win in the first battle, we would almost certainly lose the second battle due to attrition. So our plan is completely flipped. However, let me back up a bit and kind of spell the situation. I mentioned that the EFN was kicked out of the Rider Alliance, but it's important to understand how that exactly played out. In the opening stages of Season 2, a hostile faction had attacked the COA peace conference and branded itself as the new enemy. The EFN actually was very on board in joining this war, and plans were being drawn up on how we would integrate with the COA command structure, right, the Riders and the CDF. However, we wanted some assurances that we would get something out of this war, because ultimately this wasn't necessarily our enemy, and the CDF and Riders weren't necessarily our friends. This was just an alliance of convenience. And we wanted something to ensure we would get something out of this and not be taken advantage of and taken the brunt of the war. Right? We were here to reestablish the gate back to Earth. That is our ultimate win condition, and this war didn't really further that. However, the return communication, right, this was all happening in real time, in real life, right, we were sending information back and forth, was very spicy. It was a triple whammy, for the lack of a better term. Number 1, effective immediately, Eternity was removed from the Alliance, making her, once again, a lone faction and a lone ship. The COA issued in no uncertain terms that we may not traverse COA space, which, for the record, is all the space the Eternity has been in thus far. She will be escorted to the edge of the system for her safety and have a large force escort her at all times. As something to protect us, air quotes. However, from the EFN side, this was very much viewed as a babysitting force to prevent us from doing anything. We obviously declined that babysitting force. However, the real fear became when the CDF also began construction on a battleship. Myself and the Officer Corps viewed these actions as hostile in conjunction in nature. And while, once again, that battleship would likely and could likely be used in the current war against the Khans, we had almost zero doubt at this point it would be used against us after the fact. So the question quickly came, what do we do? Right? We have our mission, that's build the jump gate. We have a higher purpose, that is to get back to Earth and reconnect the system. However, at this time we are presented with a very difficult problem to solve. We cannot beat the Riders, we cannot beat the CDF, and we certainly can't beat both of them together. Right? It wouldn't even be close, that much was clear. The CDF was building a battleship, which would absolutely even prevent our ability to navigate through the system and would functionally spell lights out. We came at it from both angles. On the diplomatic end, we offered to help build multiple cruisers that would sum more than the battleship, offered once again to help in this new war that was forming. However, this quickly went nowhere. The CDF insisted that this single battleship was critical for this new war effort, but also in the same breath said the Eternity was absolutely not needed for this war effort and it should not consider coming to the front line. Simultaneously, 3 CDF squadrons were returning from the front lines to intercept the Eternity, who was patrolling near the CDF shipyard where this battleship was being constructed. On the back end, we came up with a contingency plan. We opened up secret communications with the Rider leadership, who we still had some relationship with, though not nearly as much as we originally did, and we requested that they stay out of a potential ensuing conflict. While we weren't technically allies, the Riders did have some benefits in the CDF being taken down a notch. More importantly, as long as the Rider ships were not present on the same tile, even if they went back on their word, we would have a reactionary period to get things done. Thus, we developed a plan that what we would put into effect, a secondary ship that we had at this point called the Constellation, would destroy a local trade station, followed up by pushing up one tile, and then detonating herself against a local forward operating base. The Eternity would destroy the FOB and the battleship on the tile she was currently at, which she could do fairly easily. This would instantly cripple the CDF's ability to have a functioning war economy. However, after that, instead of continuing to fight or surrendering, we would engage in a guerrilla warfare style thing, something we've never done before. We would never stay in a location long enough for a squadron to kind of pin us down in a fight, and if we did get pinned down, our goal would not be to win, it would just be to disengage. The goal was simply to destroy the CDF infrastructure enough to bring them to the negotiating table, all before the Riders would change their mind and potentially join in. Luckily, and ultimately, this never came to pass. But it was an interesting case where the EFN Navy, us, the Eternity crew, had a drastic shift in our gameplay and strategies. Gone were the days where we could realistically even take on half of a faction in a head-on conflict. Instead, we needed to shift our game plan to be much more smart and precise with our moves. However, the CDF eventually relented, probably seeing the writing on the wall of what we were planning to do, or maybe even the Riders leaked what we were going to do, which ultimately ended up being for the better because they relented, and the EFN was, in conjunction with the COA, rushed to the front, and the battleship was, under our eyes, deconstructed. Our first battle of the season would come soon thereafter. It's worth noting, at this point, we had almost no experience fighting this new foe, and we decided to go back to an old classic. If the enemy comes at us, we aggressively try to isolate a single enemy and kill one, move to the next, kill the next, kill the next, kill the next. This was obviously a very basic strategy, but this foe had never really fought us before, so we thought it could functionally work. This obviously no longer works against the CDF or Riders, but we were hoping we could get a free win out of it here, and we were very practiced with this strategy. So, ultimately, it ended up working. However, it's important to understand, when we fought the cons with this strategy, it was one cruiser and frigates. It almost didn't work, and this much weaker formation compared to what we were used to fighting compared to the CDF, a far bigger run for our money, and we really struggled to convert it into a win. They used very clever jump side tactics developed on the spot to kind of evade us constantly while slowly inflicting damage. While eventually we were able to flip the script and catch them on a jump and force them to retreat, we would get heavily damaged in the process and lose a friendly CDF vessel present on tile. That being said, we did knock out 4 KE frigates. From here, it was rapidly obvious that the COA KE war was going down the drain. That is, the larger COA was losing heavily to the KE. It was decided, once again, in the Officers of Corps, that instead of pushing to the front line and trying to kind of peck away at that stalemate, we would instead infiltrate in the back and do what we knew how to do best: be a pain in the ass in the enemy's rear. Soon thereafter, upon arriving, the KE, while they weren't able to deploy heavy assets as all of them were tied up on the front, they were able to deploy multiple frigate-based QRF forces. And while none of them were really able to bring us to our knees, they were able to attrite us, deal damage to our hull, use up our ammunition, use up our valuable hydrogen, and more. And this was quickly looking like a rerun of Season 1, where we simply lose because of our inability to continue the fight over a long time. However, the script once again got flipped. Metaphorical script, by the way. It wasn't actually scripted. The CDF faction fell to the KE in what is, at this point, the largest military operation to date. 15 ships alongside 2 battleships wiped out the CDF faction at their capital, and the faction functionally collapsed. With this, red flags went off, we had to get to work, and we made a beeline for the Khan capital. Because no longer would the slow attritional behind enemy lines thing work to destroy this faction, because we knew those battleships were probably coming towards us with our name on it. So we tried to get to the capital to force a rapid surrender. It's worth noting at this point we actually linked up with a rider vessel called the Armored Cruiser Vesuvius, or a Armored Cruiser Vesuvius, and she would tally along with us, crewed by rider POWs, which we discovered at a KE shipyard. When we approached the doorstep of the Khan capital world, we were met by a cruiser, 2 destroyers, and then a second contingent that went planet-side for something that developed. We sent the Vesuvius that deal with the planetary forces, and the Eternity would handle the cruiser and 2 destroyers. On paper, this was a fight we were not very confident in taking. We've had fights like this in the past, and the Khans proved very adept at dealing with us with just frigates, so now that they had real firepower on the table, we were pretty sure our old strategy would not work. We instead developed a new strategy. This doesn't really have a name, we just came up with it. It's called the circle battle doctrine, I guess, if you want to call it. Typically what would happen is we would engage in a circle battle with the enemy. One ship, if you can imagine it, one ship is going clockwise, and then directly across from it, that other ship is also going clockwise. So we're doing a giant orbit path around us while engaging each other. The orbit size or the diameter would be roughly 1,500 meters to 3,000 meters, give or take, of where in that circle we were. And we would trade blows. It's kind of like a fighter one-turn battle. However, unlike with fighters where enemies try to get behind the enemy, we would not want that to happen. So while we could potentially get behind the enemy, or they could potentially get behind us, our goal was to preserve the circle battle, to always continue that circle strafe. Thus, anytime they tried to close the circle, we would extend the circle. And anytime they tried to extend the circle, we would close the circle, thus always keeping it at that 15 to 3,000 meter range. This heavily played into our strength, because while we were a bigger target, and while we wouldn't win in these straight up fights anymore because we would get fire saturated, what we did win at was gunnery skill. We had the best gunnery crews in the series, or in the server, and we were able to, at a dictated range of about 1,500 to 2,000 meters, we were able to bring more fire upon an enemy than they were, relatively speaking, on us. Functionally speaking, it ended up roughly being the same because our ship is so large, but we were able to take that damage while the enemy was not. But we also did a lot of practice with our pilots to do a circle battle with our nose turned towards the enemy and using inertial dampeners off. Thus, if our nose was profiled hot on the enemy, but we were going sideways, we would continue our circle battle, but we would prevent actually a very small profile to the enemy due to how the Eternity is designed, not much larger than a cruiser at that point. In theory, all ships could jump us simultaneously, but in the opening couple battles that we tried this at, this proved incredibly difficult to execute on and often would lose a ship that attempted to do this. A while later, down the line, the battleship squadron finally arrived from transit, and we tried this tactic one more time. However, we had learnt from Season 1, don't do the same tactics more than twice, and we put a slight spin on it. This time, we tried to get into that circle battle again. However, when the call was given, instead of trying to maintain the circle at 15 to 2,000 meters, we closed the circle to as close as humanly possible. The goal was, when the decision was made and the opportunity was right, we would close and kill the enemy battleship. And this worked out okay. While ultimately we were able to force the enemy battleship and cruiser to retreat, thus kind of winning the battle, air quotes, we weren't able to destroy it, and that was ultimately the goal, and we gave up a lot to do it. We took a fair amount of damage in return, but more importantly, we were doing something else at the time, escorting civilians from the Khans, and we lost 3 out of the 5 civilian vessels, only 2 remained. This taught us another valuable lesson. With respect to the CDF and rider ships, Khan ships are something else. They just don't die. And while we were able to very often take a Khan ship from 100% functionality to 20% functionality, basically combat ineffective, going that last 20% to kill the ship took 3 to 5 times more effort than it took to get to that point thus far. Thus, we were quickly finding in battle after battle, committing for a kill would often lose us elsewhere on the battlefield. This led us to the final iteration of the Eternity battle plan. Engage in a circle battle at optimal weapon range, trade blows that we could afford to sustain but the enemy could not, and once we decide, we would close in and go for an air quotes kill. However, once the decision was made, we would disengage, consolidate with the rest of the formation, the Vesuvius, and close in on the other enemies and repeat the process. This would lead to a situation where we wouldn't kill any of the enemies, but we would have put effective fire down in a rapid fashion that most of the enemy forces would be weapon stripped and they'd be forced to pull off the battle space, thus winning us the fight. This happened in practice. This is exactly actually how it happened in practice. We got into a circle fight with the battleship, then we began to close with the battleship, and she obviously wanted to reopen the circle because they've kind of mimicked our strategy to a degree and obviously developed their own. She would then begin to flee. We would engage her. She would begin to really start to flee. Our circle battle turned into just a straight line chase, and then we would just about face and consolidate with our cruiser. And we won that battle. And this brings us to the finale, the final iteration of the battle plan that I actually don't want to spoil. You'll have to see it because it will probably be coming out fairly soon after this video. There's something to be considered here that it's very hard to put into video form and the retelling of what we did. But the Eternity, for starters, has never been part of a larger squadron, so we can never really implement highly sophisticated strategies. All of our strategies thus far, by design, have been very simplistic, because a simplistic battle or simplistic plan is versatile, and more importantly, it's easy for everyone to follow. Because most of the complexity of the Eternity battle plan and ability to win or lose comes with how our crew works together and how we execute on a basic plan. Thus, we always make sure to have extremely simplistic plans compared to perhaps one of the other factions in the series. And our success generally doesn't rely on the quality of the plan, although it does to a degree. It relies on our ability to handle curveballs and mistakes. So that's kind of where we've come so far. Hopefully our journey isn't over yet, but this is how the Eternity has, throughout straight up a year of this stuff, never been brought to the point where she's utterly lost. Now, we have lost fights, we have retreated from battles, but we have never gotten to the point where we've been cornered and destroyed. And I think a lot of that involves our flexibility in the battle space, our ability of our officers to talk together, come up with variable battle plans, go back to old battle plans, and more. Alright, I've been talking for quite some time. Thanks for watching. If this was interesting to you, consider watching this series where these events occur organically and regularly. Who knows, this might be entertaining to you. For those who are already a part of this adventure and have watched it for some time now, consider supporting it to continue the existence of this thing. It isn't cheap to run the server, and it's a lot of time and effort. However, every little bit helps, so if you're feeling generous, cool, and if not, no worries. Regardless, thanks for watching. I appreciate the support thus far. Later, guys.